Welcome to you all, and welcome to my panel. We've got half an hour set aside to talk about one of the most fascinating topics in the digital startup world, which is how do you build a unicorn? How do you create a unicorn? Maybe you start with a daddy and a mummy unicorn, I don't know. We're going to figure out how to make a startup succeed. And on this panel to discuss this great topic, we have Hilary Mein, the president of Digital Europe, the organizers of this event, Indrek Heinlohr from Verif, Cybelle Roland, who is telling me she has seen many, many unicorns and been in many, many unicorns in her time, but is now Chief Operating Officer at Aerospace Lab, and Balázs Vinay, who is at the Hungarian Association of Digital Companies. I'm glad I don't have to say that in Hungarian, but that's what I'm told this stands for, IVSZ. Welcome to you all. I'm going to start with you, Hilary, because you've got the biggest gossip of everyone on the panel, because you were a judge on the Unicorn Award that is going to be presented very shortly downstairs. And I've been told you're not allowed to give us any spoilers about who won. Sorry about that. But you know, without mentioning any names, you must have come through lots of successful startups, lots of nearly successful startups. What was it you learned by looking at all those companies who are trying to make it?
So first of all, I should say that this is not my first rodeo. I'm also head of strategy and technology for Nokia's global sales and marketing organization, and I also spent many, many years consulting to startups. So I'm just to ground it. So when I look at unicorns, first of all, and I think we'll have a debate about this notion of a unicorn is a company that can create a €1 billion valuation. We had an interesting discussion, I think we'll continue it, about whether that's really the right way to think about it anymore. But what I'm looking for is, there are a lot of great companies, startups with great ideas. So the first question is, do they really have something that can be differentiable? Where they can create either product, solution, services that has either some intellectual property around them or something that will enable them to be a little different in the marketplace, command some kind of share, whether they can attract customers. And then I look also at whether or not it's something that can scale from a market perspective. But what I also look at, and what's important to me, is execution. So you'll hear most VCs will look at the team. Who is the team that's leading? Is it a team that can scale that business? Is it a team that's cohesive? Is it a team that has the skill sets they need to scale and grow? And obviously, they can adapt the team over time. But you want to see, if you're going to look at something as a unicorn, you want it to be developed enough that you can see a path to money, a path to sustainable revenue and margin, because if there's no margin, you can't get a valuation. And those are, I would say, the things I look at as a starting point.
Okay, well, that's a great introduction. You said that all without mentioning the name of the winner, which I'm a little bit annoyed about, but that was the deal. You've referred a lot of times to this concept of the unicorn, which, just to take a couple of steps back, that's the usual kind of way in which people in this space define success. And if you look at the definition of what it means, is your valuation over €1 billion, right? I'd like to turn to our other panelists and say, is this still a meaningful way to measure success in the startup space? Indrek?
Yeah, no, very good question. I think it's important to recognize that becoming a unicorn is not the finish line, right? It's just an icon, it's just a label. And yes, does it show something? Yes, it shows something. But valuations at this stage of a company, they're largely based on potential, right? Mm-hmm. And if anything, it means that the road that you have ahead to actually realize that potential might even be more difficult than the road that you have behind in terms of becoming a unicorn, right? So, whether unicorn is still a relevant term, I'm sure others will have some views on that as well. I will not give that away, but I think that is an important part to recognize, that it's really about the things that Hilary mentioned. I think I would add to that also uniqueness, right? Why is it that your company is uniquely positioned to actually solve this problem and be hugely successful? And kind of the Michael Porter's sustainable competitive advantage, I think that is still a valid term as well.
Okay, and would you agree with that, Sibel? I know you have some strong opinions on this topic.
Yeah, I think what we want to say when we are talking about unicorn, of course, is the question of the valuation of a company, but which can be quite volatile. But the important point, I think, is to recognize that we can build companies in a few years, like 5 to 10 years, when they are very young companies, that can really challenge the incumbent on the market. In my previous company, which was twice a unicorn in 22, our competitors were multi-billion companies. Their revenue were above 1 billion revenue, all of them. So that means, can we challenge this kind of company? In our case at Aerospace Lab, our competitors are the big primes like Airbus, Boeing, Raytheon. That means that we need to strengthen ourselves, show that our product can compete with these big guys. And I think that's the path that we want to follow is, I hope, to become a unicorn. But that means that we must have the mindset to be at their level from the very first day. I think that's a big difference that we see in startups. If you want to be a startup successful that becomes international, that becomes a world leader, maybe a unicorn, that means that you have to structure everything in the company like a very big one. And this is a key point, I think.
Okay, so think big, have the numbers to back up your company. Balázs, what's your experience of how well companies, particularly in Hungary, are able to do that in practice? What challenges are they facing?
Yeah, that used to be I was an entrepreneur, and I went through in this journey, even though I was not even close to the billions level. But these symbolic moments is very important from the entrepreneur's point of view. That even though this is a very volatile and bumpy road, and of course the time is a very long process, so that's when you're doing on your own journey in this venture field, it's very important that you have some feedbacks. That's where are you exactly in your road. And of course, being in a billion valuation, even in a small country like in Hungary, it's a very meaningful moment. However, it's never happened yet. So we just hope that somebody soon will be able to achieve that level. And this is a very important thing in a very fragmented territory like Europe. Because of course in the US you have a very big, unique, very big and stable market. But in Europe, this is very, very fragmented. So that if you are able to achieve a level like a billion valuation, it means that you are really an international player. And this is changing your mindset. It's changing the capability, what you are able to achieve. Even though this is just part of your journey, and probably later on it will be under the billion level and probably twice as billion as you talked about.
So if you make it here, you can make it anywhere, as Frank Sinatra once said. You mentioned fragmentation, and I know this is a topic that people talk about a lot in Europe. I've worked for a long time as a finance reporter, and one of the things people tell me is, you just can't get the finance in Europe. That there's no kind of venture capital, there's no capital markets, and that's what really distinguishes us from Silicon Valley or other kind of innovative parts of the world. Do you agree with that analysis? Do you see that changing?
I guess it's changing, but still there is a difference. And then this is, first of all, there is a mindset difference which is coming together with the experience. Of course, if we're talking about the people, investors on the West Coast in the US, they have much more experience, much more deeper track record with these type of companies. This is just started, especially in Central Eastern Europe in the last 2 decades. And in these last 2 decades, of course, that you need to build it from a jungle, warrior mode, how you are able to build in a highway. And this is coming generation to generation of the entrepreneurs. And this is also visible in the valuations. So that's, of course, that if you have in a company somewhere in the Silicon Valley, with the same potential, possibly your valuation is not going to be the same as in Central Eastern Europe. But in a point when your mindset is really turning into the global mode, this is disappearing. So you need to be able to manage this gap in an early stage, especially in the seed and first round and second round. But when you are in the game with the big guys, of course, you will be at the same table. And you need to feel yourself as an equivalent player on this field.
Mm-hmm. I know, you referred to kind of fragmentation again, and there was something you were talking about before, Indrek, because Verif works with, anti-money laundering checks and identity checks and age verification, and I'm very much aware that these things can often be very different in every single EU member state, in every single European country. How do you cope with that in practice?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and let me be a little bit controversial here as well, because it's interesting that we are on this panel. I mean, Verif, as a company, we are a proud European unicorn. We have 80% of our people are in Europe, within EU. 80% of our revenue comes from outside of EU, right? It used to be a much smaller number, but now that the British left us, then that is only less than 80% that is coming from today's EU. Around 90% of our capital has come from outside of EU, right? So in this sense, if I want to be controversial, and say, hey, how do you build a European unicorn? I would say, sell outside of Europe and get your capital from, the US and the UK. Now, maybe I don't want to be that controversial, but I mean, there is definitely some truth to that. To answer your question, fragmentation in Europe, I think, for us it's a symptom. I mean, that's the reason why so small part of our revenue is coming out of European Union to some extent. Is it something that we think about every day? Not really, to be honest. We follow the business, we follow the demand. We see that there is greater business opportunities in US and elsewhere. But I think it is a problem, and I think, like you're saying as well, some of the things, even if we think that they are uniform across Europe, like AML, anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing directives, from the European Central Bank, they are kind of very, straightforward in a way what you should do. But then if you go to the country-level implementations, the details matter, and the devil is in the details. And for us, let's say roughly 50% of our revenue is coming from kind of regulated use cases, and that's where we do have European customers coming to us and saying, hey, can we use your services in country X, in country Y, in country Z? Well, in this country there is this special thing that you need to do, and so on. So I think it is hard to scale, and I think, when we talk about these pan-European standards, I think it's important to consider the technical aspects of that standards as well, and really these details which make a difference, like you said.
Indeed. Sibel, we were talking about regulations before, and you mentioned, I know we're in Brussels, so people love to talk about policy, and they love to talk about regulation, and who's going to be the next whatever commissioner. Is that a big part of the challenge of being a startup for you?
What I have seen in my previous company and today at Aerospace Lab are different things. First, we are international, so that means that we have to create legal entities in different countries to be able to address and sell our products. And I think this is something that is quite, I wouldn't say easy, but as I was saying, it's a question of structuring things and having the right competencies internally, because of course, for example, in our case now, we are manufacturing things in Belgium, but we want to sell in the US. That means that, okay, you have to set up a lot of things like transfer pricing policy, export control policy, a lot of regulation, these type of things. But of course, you need to have the experts inside, so that's not a problem. I would say what I see in the space industry is that Europe is fragmented, as you were saying, because we are in a field where sovereignty means something, and it's not European sovereignty, it's national sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So it's either it has a very good advantage, because that means that, for example, the Belgian government helps us a lot by different grants or subsidies or programs for R&D, this type of things, and this is very strong, I would say, everywhere in Europe, where every country support a lot the startups. But then, I mean that, for example, for a Belgian company, it's quite difficult to sell to French institutions because they have their own space industry. So in this case, we are not playing the European game, I think. It's quite of a problem.
Yeah, indeed. Hilary, we've heard a lot about kind of the difference between Europe and the US there, and capital from the US for companies that are from Europe, and a lot of different stories. That's interesting for me to ask you because you're from America, right? And now working for a European company. What for you is the biggest difference between those two jurisdictions? Is it the culture? Is it the politics and the regulation? Is it the market? What's the biggest thing that jumps out at you?
So, I'm going to say two things, if that's okay. So, risk profile, right? If you're going to, so capital requires a risk profile. So the typical VC formula is for every 10 investments, I expect to lose completely on 9 and make money on 1. That's typical. That is not always the culture. Like in Germany is a great example. In Germany, people have very low risk profiles. They're just not interested in investing in a kind of environment where they're going to lose 10 times and then have a big jump. So, and I say that as I live in Amsterdam, and the Dutch, of course, kind of have some fun with the Germans, let's say, on that particular, because the Dutch are a little more, have a higher risk profile. But the risk profile is just different, and that's also how structurally the banks work. So I think there's structural differences between the US and Europe. The other thing, and then we talked about capital markets earlier today in the conference, and it's a really important point for Europe because, in fact, as the Prime Minister of Belgium pointed out this morning, the European pension funds stick their money into places overseas, and then that overseas guys make money on it and come and feed it, help us do startups sometimes. So we need to work that through. So that's one thing. But the other thing is this issue of harmonization. So we just published a report called The Single Market: A Love Story. I've been working in Europe since 1990, so a pretty long time, and it's kind of home for me. So I really have despite my accent, a strong vested interest in seeing us be successful. And my other observation is that this harmonization of regulations, so we have regulations in Brussels, they translate into 27 different things. And in fact, even within the countries, in Italy or Germany, you might have 7 more variations. This makes it very hard to do business, and that's a huge difference with the US. Yes, the states have different tax regimes in the US, but other than that, it's pretty simple. Most of the labor laws are very common. Most of the rest of it is pretty common. So it's much easier to scale a business in the US. And don't even talk to me about China, right? So, because there are other economies besides the US and Europe. So that's a huge difference in terms of our ability. So this notion of harmonization of the way that we implement laws in Europe is incredibly important, and it makes it very hard for scale-ups. And I do encourage you all, Single Market: A Love Story does, what we did in that book that Cecilia keeps talking about, is take the story of a scale-up and the different roadblocks you run into. I encourage everyone to give it to everybody you know in politics, to help explain very simply what the challenges are for a business.
I hope you released your love story in time for Valentine's Day.
It just came out, actually, sorry.
Oh, well,
almost.
Nearly perfect timing. One thing that I was kind of inspired by this panel title is it's about how to build a unicorn, how to succeed as a startup, and I'm sure people in the audience are taking careful notes about this from your experience. But one thing I've always heard from startups when I've talked to them is that the best thing they've ever done is fail. They failed at something, they learned something from it, and then they picked themselves up, started again, without a sense of shame and with just a sense of, I'm going to learn from that. Do you kind of agree that's an important ingredient in this space? And what's the biggest failure you've ever had and that you're able to learn from?
Once Peter Thiel said in a conference in Budapest that when the question was why it's so low a number of unicorns are in Europe than in the US, he answered that's because if somebody earns 100 million in Europe, they're going for a decade-long vacation. And this is more or less true, so that literally, when making a successful exit, like myself, I didn't start it immediately another type of entrepreneurship. So the serial entrepreneurship in the US is part of the mindset. It's part of really the DNA of the entrepreneurs there. Just want to make it bigger and bigger. And how many good stories are we know, like Elon Musk, who are just, playing with so many companies in the same time. But in Europe, somehow this is coming together with the risk appetite. And of course, when you went through a journey and finally made some success, you feel that's okay. Am I really want to make a huge risk again, which is probably causing fails? And there's the fear of failing. This is really, really somehow blocking the capability of the bigger stories.
Yeah, I would say that to build a unicorn, you need to have the ambition, and it's a bit the same. I think that there's a point when you have grown up a company as a founder, for example, or as investors, and maybe you have another company wanted to buy you. So the question is, would you sell yourself, make an exit, have a nice life, maybe reinvest or not? Or do you go on and say, no, I'm going to show them that I can be more and more? I think that's something Americans have, that maybe you are still a bit shy. It is changing. So I think it's really a question of, are the founders of the company really ambitious, and are their investors ready to be as ambitious as them, maybe?
Europeans are too shy. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no,
First, can I just say, there's no European and there's no American, okay? There's a lot of different kinds of styles. Yeah. If you go across different parts of Europe, you'll find very different risk appetites and stuff. I'm just yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
Fair point.
Yeah, no, I was reflecting on, what have been my failures and our company's failures, and I think something that probably many people who are in startups these days can relate to. The key challenge around a startup scale-up is that your growth trajectory is not linear, right? You have phases where you're going really fast, and then you're going down and going slower, and then going up and going down. And the key question for kind of a founder or top management of the startup is, how much do you lean in on growth, right? And I think, in Veriff, I can say sincerely, we've made some mistakes, right? We've had rounds of reductions. Even last year, we had 2 rounds of reductions. I think for any management, hiring people, it's kind of the fundamental promise that you give is that you create jobs for these people. And when you have to do reductions, it's very hard emotionally. But then I think that's kind of the question, right? Do you lean on that growth, and do you try to maximize, or do you recognize that actually there's a risk to leaning in on growth? But yeah, I think that's kind of looking back at myself and our company. I think kind of having to do reductions is kind of what we would consider as the greatest failures of the management.
Yeah. Okay. That's a message we can all take home, I think. We've had a lot of talked about the problems in Europe. Capital, regulations, risk appetite, risk profile. I don't want this to turn into a complaining session. And you're all based in Europe, and I guess you're all happy to be here. So, as we approach the end of this panel, let's leave on a high note and say, what do you love most about being in Europe? What's the best thing about being here for you?
I can start, and I'll be a little bit maybe selfish here and promote my country, Estonia. I think for me, it's not really for us about being in Europe, but it's much more important that we are in Estonia as a startup. And I think Estonia has created a fantastic ecosystem, very simple to do business. I mean, any of you can actually go online right now and start a business, and you will have legal entity registered before we end this session. So we have your startup already. A very simple taxation, very simple to deal with the government because of all the digital services that we have and so on. And because we have this history, we are, as Veriff, we became the 10th unicorn in Estonia, right? That means we have actually a great ecosystem of companies before us that we can tap into for talent, for support, for advice, even like early stage funding and so on. So yeah, I think Europe should look at Estonia and see how to replicate it even more in other countries.
Okay, the best thing about Europe is it has Estonia.
Exactly.
That's quite a message. Other positive messages we can leave with.
Just being a little bit on the other side, that's, you know, when I started my journey as an entrepreneur, that this was exactly the time when Hungary joined to the European Union, and this gave me a huge opportunity. That's, you know, that's why I was the first generation in the country who were really able to building international entrepreneurship. And starting in a small country, it's also given an option that you need to be very soon international. And this colorful thing in Europe, this is beautiful. So that's so many different culture. Of course, it's coming together with so many regulation, it's so many legislation and so on and so forth. But this really gives us an opportunity that how we are able to build a business model which is fits to all. And this, if you are able to going through on this journey, of course, it's much easier to going in other side of the world. Yeah, so this is also a great thing.
Okay.
I would say that at the moment we are trying to develop on hire in the US. So I would say the big advantage in Europe, I would say, is that about talent. We have people that are loyal to the company.
Mm-hmm.
Usually when people are joining a company, they really want to leave a venture, spend years in the company. Maybe not 20 years like our grandparents, but even young engineers just graduating, they want to spend 3, 4, 5 years. Of course, they are very demanding, so that means that in terms of managing them, we must take care of making sure of our vision, of our ethics, this kind of things. But people are very well trained, loyal to the company, in average in Europe, not very expensive. So I would say, and life is nice in Europe, so I think it's the perfect place. Here, I'm in Europe, in Belgium. In our company, we are 200 people, already 14 nationalities. So that means that we are attractive to a lot of people.
And none of you have said you're in Europe for the weather, which is good, because I wouldn't have believed you on this grey February in Belgium. Hilary, a closing comment. You know, you're president of Digital Europe. Are you glad you're not president of Digital America?
I choose to be in Europe. I'm actually, anyone here Dutch? No. I'm taking my inburgering at the end of March to stay. I've passed half. I have to pass the other half. I like being in Europe. I like the values in Europe. And I think it's not that different from the US, right? If we compare it to other parts of the world, there's a lot that's common. And I think, but I absolutely love being here. And I think that Digital Europe does some really interesting work. And I am passionate, as I said, about Europe, not just Estonia, not just Belgium, not just Romania, but the whole. And I think we have so much opportunity. So to turn it into a positive, the potential for Europe, as we can harmonize, as we can work together more effectively, is just huge. So we have amazing talent. We have tremendous universities. We have all the ingredients you need for massive success. And we have a lot of success. I mean, part of our issue is we're so comfortable, right? Life is very comfortable. So I think it's a good place to be.
Hard to take risks when you're comfortable. Well, that's really true. I've been told I have to let everyone go because there's the prize award in
coming right up.
In 10 minutes. So we're going to give you all time to get back down to the main auditorium to find out who the future Unicorn of Europe award will go to this year. Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks most of all to my panelists.